When I started looking into Cicero, one thing about him immediately stood out. Almost every important man in the final years of the Roman Republic had some kind of military power behind him. Pompey had conquered huge parts of the Mediterranean. Julius Caesar had his legions in Gaul. Mark Antony was an experienced general, and Octavian would eventually build his power around Caesar's name and soldiers. Cicero had none of that. He wasn't a great general, he never conquered a foreign kingdom, and he wasn't even born into one of Rome's powerful political families. Yet somehow Cicero became consul, the highest elected office in the Roman Republic. He became one of the most famous men in Rome, exposed a conspiracy against the government, and later challenged some of the most powerful military leaders of his time. Cicero's main weapon was much simpler. He was very good at speaking. This might not sound particularly impressive compared to commanding thousands of soldiers, but in the Roman Republic, being able to persuade people could take you surprisingly far. Cicero built almost his entire career around this idea, and for most of his life, it worked. The problem was that Rome was changing. Cicero became a master of politics at almost exactly the same time that political power was beginning to move away from the Senate and toward the battlefield. So to understand Cicero, we first have to understand how someone like him managed to become powerful in the first place.
Cicero was born in 106 BC in Arpinum, a town around 100 kilometers southeast of Rome. His family was wealthy enough to give him a good education, but they weren't part of the small group of aristocratic families that traditionally dominated Roman politics. This was important because Roman politics was heavily influenced by family connections. If your father or grandfather had been a consul, people already knew your name. You had political connections before your career even started.
Cicero didn't have this advantage. The Romans had a term for people like him, who entered the highest levels of politics without coming from a family of previous consuls: novus homo, or new man. So Cicero needed another way to make a name for himself. He studied law, philosophy, and rhetoric, and eventually began working as an advocate. Roman courts were much more public than modern courts, and trials could become major political events. A successful lawyer wasn't just someone who understood the law. He had to know how to tell a story, how to appeal to a crowd, and how to make the other side look terrible. Cicero turned out to be extremely good at this. One of the cases that established his reputation involved Gaius Verres, the former governor of Sicily. Verres was accused of using his position to enrich himself at the expense of the people he governed. He was wealthy, well-connected, and defended by one of Rome's leading advocates. Cicero traveled to Sicily, gathered evidence against him, and prepared such a strong case that Verres eventually went into exile before the trial was finished. Cases like this made Cicero famous, and in Rome, fame as a speaker could easily become political influence. Cicero began moving through the traditional political offices of the Republic until, in 63 BC, he achieved something remarkable. He became consul. For someone without a famous political family behind him, reaching Rome's highest elected office was a huge achievement. But Cicero had very little time to enjoy it.
One of the men Cicero defeated in the election was Lucius Sergius Catilina, usually known as Catiline. Catiline was an aristocrat with serious political ambitions who had repeatedly failed to become consul. Not long after Cicero took office, reports began appearing that Catiline and his supporters were planning to overthrow the government. The exact details are difficult to reconstruct, because much of what we know comes from Cicero himself and from historians writing later. Cicero obviously had an interest in presenting the conspiracy as a serious threat. But there was clearly something going on. An armed rebellion connected to Catiline was forming in northern Italy, and Cicero claimed that Catiline's supporters were also planning violence inside Rome. This led to the moment Cicero is probably most famous for. In November of 63 BC, Catiline attended a meeting of the Senate.
Cicero stood up and directly accused him of conspiring against the Republic. His speech began with a line that would become one of the most famous sentences in Latin literature. Quo usque tandem abutere, Catilina, patientia nostra. Basically, how long, Catiline, are you going to keep abusing our patience? Cicero laid out the accusations against him in front of the Senate and presented Catiline as an enemy of the state. Shortly afterward, Catiline left Rome and joined the armed forces gathering outside the city. Cicero now had to deal with Catiline's remaining supporters in Rome. Several conspirators were arrested, and the Senate debated what should happen to them. Julius Caesar argued against executing them, while Cato supported the death penalty. Cicero ultimately had the prisoners executed without a normal trial. At the time, this looked like the greatest success of his career. Catiline's rebellion was defeated. Cicero was celebrated for protecting the Republic, and he was even called Pater Patriae, father of the fatherland. Cicero had reached the top of Roman politics, largely through reputation, persuasion, and public speaking. But the way he handled the conspiracy would soon come back to haunt him.
Roman citizens had certain legal protections, and executing the conspirators without trial gave Cicero's enemies an obvious way to attack him. In 58 BC, the politician Publius Clodius Pulcher helped pass a law that threatened exile for anyone who had executed a Roman citizen without trial. Cicero wasn't mentioned by name, but everyone knew who the law was aimed at. Cicero left Rome. His property was confiscated, and his house on the Palatine was destroyed. He was eventually allowed to return, but his exile revealed an important weakness in the kind of power he had built. Cicero's influence depended on the political system around him. He needed the courts, the Senate, elections, and public opinion to matter. At the same time, 3 other politicians were becoming far more powerful: Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar. Pompey had enormous military prestige. Crassus had enormous wealth. And Caesar left Rome to conquer Gaul, where years of warfare gave him money, fame, and, most importantly, an experienced army that was personally loyal to him. Cicero could attack someone in a speech and damage his reputation. Caesar could arrive with thousands of soldiers. For a while, both kinds of power existed within the same political system. But in 49 BC, Caesar crossed the Rubicon and marched into Italy. The political dispute between Caesar and his opponents became a civil war. Cicero eventually sided with Pompey, although he was never particularly enthusiastic about the situation. Pompey lost, Caesar won, and Cicero was eventually pardoned. Cicero continued writing and speaking, but his position had clearly changed. Rome still had a Senate and still called itself a republic, but Caesar now held a level of personal power that would have been difficult to imagine earlier in Cicero's career. Then, in 44 BC, Caesar was assassinated. For Cicero, this looked like an opportunity to restore the old political system. Instead, it gave him one final enemy. Cicero wasn't involved in Caesar's assassination, although he generally approved of what the conspirators had done. He hoped Caesar's death would allow the Senate to regain control. But Mark Antony, one of Caesar's closest political allies, had other ideas. Cicero quickly came to see Antony as another potential dictator, and once again, he responded in the way he knew best. He gave speeches. Between 44 and 43 BC, Cicero delivered a series of speeches against Antony, known as the Philippics. He attacked Antony's character, his political decisions, and his ambitions, and tried to convince the Senate that Antony was a threat to the Republic. At first, Cicero actually seemed to be succeeding. Antony became increasingly isolated politically, and Cicero found an unlikely ally in Caesar's young adopted heir, Octavian. Octavian was only around 19 years old, and Cicero seems to have believed that the Senate could use him against Antony. Octavian had Caesar's name, and, more importantly, access to soldiers loyal to Caesar's memory.
The plan made sense from Cicero's perspective. Use Octavian's military power to defeat Antony, then restore authority to the Senate. Unfortunately, Cicero badly underestimated Octavian. After using the Senate to strengthen his own position, Octavian marched on Rome and forced his way into the consulship. Not long afterward, he reached an agreement with Antony and Lepidus. The three men formed what became known as the Second Triumvirate, and one of the first things they did was remove their political enemies.
The triumvirate created proscription lists containing the names of people who could legally be killed and whose property could then be confiscated. Cicero's name was on one of them. Antony had not forgotten the speeches Cicero had made against him. Cicero tried to escape Italy, but Antony's men eventually caught him in December of 43 BC. According to the later account of Plutarch, Cicero stopped trying to flee when the soldiers reached him and allowed them to kill him. They cut off his head and his hands and brought them back to Rome. They were then displayed on the rostra, the public speaking platform in the Roman Forum. There was an obvious symbolism to this. Cicero's hands had written his attacks against Antony, and his voice had delivered them. Now the parts of his body most closely associated with his political career were being displayed in the same place where Roman politicians gave their speeches. Cicero was dead, and the political system he had spent much of his career defending wasn't far behind him. Octavian and Antony eventually defeated Caesar's assassins. Years later, they turned against each other. Octavian won, and the Roman Republic was replaced by a new political order under the man who would become Augustus.
So, Cicero clearly didn't save the Roman Republic. He couldn't stop Caesar, he couldn't stop Antony, and he completely misjudged Octavian. But his career still tells us something interesting about how power worked in Rome. Cicero managed to become one of the most important politicians of his generation without being a great general and without coming from one of Rome's dominant political families. He did it largely by building a reputation around his ability to speak, argue, and persuade. And for much of his life, that was enough. The Roman Republic was a political system where public reputation mattered enormously. Senators had to convince other senators. Politicians had to win elections. Lawyers argued in front of crowds. A talented speaker could turn a court case into a political career, and Cicero understood this better than almost anyone. The problem wasn't that Cicero's way of gaining power didn't work. The problem was that the system in which it worked was disappearing. By the end of his life, Rome's most important political disagreements were no longer being settled primarily in courts, elections, or Senate debates. They were increasingly being settled by men with armies. Cicero had spent his life mastering the politics of the Republic. And just as he reached the top, Rome began playing by different rules. Cicero had figured out how to win without an army. He just lived at the moment when Rome decided that you needed one.